Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new Leading in Complex Times session. My name is Carlos Luca de Tena. I am the head of operations of the Center for the Governance of Change, which is the IE University Center that studies the political, the economic and societal implications of the current technological revolution. Today's session topic is data privacy and how to protect personal data while fighting the pandemic. And I am really happy to be joined today by Carissa Belliz, who is a research fellow at the University of Oxford, and she's specialized in data, ethics, and public policy. Carissa actually has recently been appointed Associate Professor of Philosophy at the University of Oxford, and she's also currently advising the Spanish government in the development of a Charter of Digital Rights. On top of that, she actually also published a book very recently called Privacy is Power, Why and How You Should Take Back Control of Your Data. So hello, Carissa. Congratulations for the appointment and your book.
Thank you, Carlos. It's great to be here.
Well, Carissa is also one of our research directors here at the IE Center for the Governance of Change. And she's been leading for the last couple of years the research program called Data, Privacy and the Individual. This is a research program that aims at contributing to a better understanding of the ethics of privacy in the current context of data sharing and collection, and in which more than 15 international researchers have been involved. The results of this program were actually recently published a few months ago. So you're very welcome to download them all and read them on our website at cgc.ie.edu. So today, Carissa will help us understand how we can protect our personal data while at the same time being efficient in the fight against the COVID pandemic. We've all seen that the pandemic has accelerated many technological trends, and one of them is data collection. Governments from around the world are turning to technology to collect, analyze, and personal data to try to contain the virus. And we've seen that in many different forms, from the very restrictive Chinese system with contact tracing apps and QR codes to Israel that actually just a couple of days ago approved tracking the phones of all COVID-19 carriers, to the debate that is happening in Europe with some governments trying to implement centralized contact tracing apps with very limited results, I have to say, and other European member states putting their trust on Apple and Google model for their apps. So the contact tracing apps is just one example, but the pandemic is raising key data governance questions regarding the handling of personal movement, health data. And so what I think we should ask ourselves is how can liberal societies like ours use personal data to fight the pandemic? And in a wider sense, how can we use personal data for the common good while at the same time protecting individual rights, such as privacy? So during this session, we will have a presentation by Carissa for about 20 minutes, and then we will open a Q&A session. So you're very welcome to submit your questions through the LinkedIn Live. You have a tab for comments. And I'm sure Carissa has a lot of answers and interesting insights about this question. So Carissa, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Carlos. I hope not to disappoint. I may have more questions than answers. That's typical of philosophers, I'm afraid. But I'll try to give a small snapshot of privacy today and the challenges we're facing now, and a bit of context as well. So just before the pandemic, it was very clear that privacy was a very contested area and a kind of arena of political strife. The privacy battles, if you will, started at the beginning of the century with newly founded tech companies like Google instantiating a new business model based on surveillance. But it would be years until ordinary citizens like you and I realized what was happening and what was the business model, and what was the deal that we supposedly agreed to terms and conditions that were long enough that nobody could read them, hard enough that nobody could understand them, and even if you could, that it didn't matter because there was no negotiating and they could change at any time. So the beginning of the century was beginning with a lot of optimism, a lot of faith in tech, a lot of joy that we had these new tools that helped us navigate the world in a different way. And it was only as time went by and we started to learn about the details of this business model that there ensued what has been dubbed a tech clash. So the new tech companies weren't these kids in hoodies who came to make the world a better place, but they were data predators who had taken our data without asking permission, not to us, not to government. And by that time, it seemed like it was too late to recall our data, not only because the business model had already been in place for more than a decade, but also because governments had an interest in this data. After the 9/11 attacks, there was a big trauma suffered by the whole world, not only the United States, in which governments thought that they could use the data, make a copy of the data to keep citizens safe, although in fact that hasn't panned out the way we hoped it would, and it doesn't seem like that kind of mass bulk collection of data is as efficient and as useful in a particular case of making citizens safer. So right before the pandemic, there was a tech clash and there was a lot of questions about the tech companies. Every week on the newspapers, we had both scandals and also articles questioning the methods used by these tech companies. And it's in this context that the EA carried out this research project on differential privacy and the ethics of privacy. And the idea was that privacy is very important. We sort of lost track of it for a while. We were dazzled by tech, but now we're remembering that it's extremely important. We have to take care of it. And at the same time, we're stuck. We seem to be stuck, or we're in a moment in which it's assumed that the normal business model in the internet age is to deal with personal data. So we wanted to ask whether it was possible to make use of data for businesses, but at the same time protect privacy. Essentially, the challenge is to, if we want to use personal data, to transform it into non-personal data so that privacy can be protected. And this is harder done than said, because even if we take the GDPR, which was an incredible feat, historical feat, it takes too narrow a view of what counts as non-personal data or pseudonymous or anonymous data. Because in fact, we have been shown time and again that it's relatively easy to re-identify people from an anonymous data set. So we researched the method of differential privacy, which is a mathematical method that inserts mathematical noise into a database such that every individual gets protected. You cannot infer either that any particular individual is in the data set, nor any particular characteristic about any individual, or at least that's the theory of it. So we were in the midst of this kind of revival of privacy, and then the pandemic hit. The coronavirus pandemic has aggravated power asymmetries that were already there and that were being challenged at the time. So for instance, from the time that the tech companies have become dominant, it's been a little bit of a fiction, this argument that, well, if you don't want to use tech, just don't use it. You always have that option. And there are at least two reasons for that. One is that it's incredibly costly for somebody not to use tech. So, if you want to be a full participant in society, you are more or less required to have a Facebook account, in some cases, to have a Twitter account, to have email, certainly, to use these tools that your competitors are using. And also, even if you say, okay, I'm willing to pay the price, I'm not going to use this tech, it's almost inevitable to be tracked by them. So even if you've never had a Facebook account, Facebook has a shadow profile on you. And in the same way, even if you want to stay away from Google as much as possible, their ads are everywhere on the internet. And so it was a bit of a fiction that we could not just go without technology, but that fiction has been completely exposed in the pandemic, because any kind of illusion of voluntariness in the use of technology completely disappeared for people who were in lockdown. There were two options: either you were a key worker who had to risk your life in working, or if you wanted to keep your job, you had to use these tech platforms. You have to use Zoom, you have to use email, and all of these expose us to data collection. And in fact, many companies have made use of this moment to collect even more data, which is extremely ethically questionable. And if you look at the stock market, most of the big tech companies have done extremely well during this period. So as you can see, that kind of power asymmetry got even worse during the pandemic. We didn't have a choice anymore. We couldn't even tell ourselves that we had a choice. And yet, surprisingly, there was much more resistance than many could have imagined. So, for instance, when it was exposed that Zoom wasn't using end-to-end encryption when it had claimed to do so, there was a huge scandal, and it was big enough that Zoom had to promise that it would enable end-to-end encryption. And here they tried another strategy. They argued that, well, they promised that they would do that, but only for paying users. And again, there was a huge backlash that made them reconsider, and now they have promised end-to-end encryption for all users. So that's an example of how, even though we were cornered and everybody felt like they had to use this platform for the purposes of work, education, and that those kinds of basic necessities, privacy has become important enough that we are setting sort of minimal standards of, for instance, cybersecurity, like end-to-end encryption, that are now taken to be just a minimal requirement that everybody should fulfill no matter what. Another interesting development was, like Carlos mentioned, the contact tracing apps. And this was interesting for many reasons. One is that obviously the pandemic is a terrible situation that we want to leave as soon as possible. And the contact tracing apps seemed like a way in which we could leave lockdown in a safer way. And it was interesting because this was, for many people, kind of the first response, or for many governments and in many countries. So many of the first conversations in the public sphere, rather than worrying about producing more masks or more protective equipment or vaccines or treatment, the focus was incredibly on contact tracing apps. And very quickly, two models emerged: the centralized approach and the decentralized approach. The centralized approach collects data from phones. They collect data regarding which phones have been in contact with each other. Sometimes this is called a Bluetooth handshake or a digital handshake, and sends it to the centralized database, typically a health institution, in which people can look at who has been in contact with whom, and when somebody turns out to have the virus, then hopefully you can track who that person has been in contact with. The decentralized approach functions similarly. These are contact apps that use Bluetooth to record who has been in contact with whom. But instead of sending that data to a centralized database, the users get notified if they have been in contact with someone who may be infected. So the public health authorities never get a list of who has been in contact with whom. And this was thought to be both a lot more privacy protecting, but also equally effective at notifying people whether they might be at risk and they should test themselves. Some governments tried to design a centralized approach. Famously, the UK started with that approach, even though many experts warned the NHS, the National Health Service, that it probably wouldn't work. Among other reasons, because, again, quite soon into the pandemic, Google and Apple decided to team up to create an API to support contact tracing apps, but only the decentralized approaches. And that meant that centralized approaches to contact tracing were probably not going to work as well. if the platforms didn't support them. So for instance, a user would have to have the app open at all times, so you couldn't even make a call or use another app, and that would drain the battery, and people would have to make sure that the app wasn't going dormant every now and again. So it was quite demanding, and it was pretty clear that it wasn't going to work as well as it could work. So because Apple and Google teamed up in this way, the NHS was forced to rethink its approach and start from scratch and design a decentralized app, which is still being designed. And this was very interesting because on the one hand, if you're somebody who cares about privacy, you might say, well, this is a good thing because it seems like our privacy was better protected. But at the same time, it showed that these companies have too much power and that they're being treated as if they were governments or even world governments. And it's good when they protect users, but for users to have to trust them in order for our rights to be respected is far, far from ideal. And in fact, this has panned out in ways that are not ideal. So a few days ago, it was revealed that Google, and we should always remember that Google's business model is based on surveillance. They need personal data to sell ads, and they get most of their income from personal ads. So it seems that Android users, even though they're using a contact tracing app that doesn't use GPS, that only uses Bluetooth, and that health authorities don't get any kind of access to this person's data, they have to enable location services. So they have to enable their GPS. And the assumption here, people think that Google is just using the opportunity to once again collect more data than necessary to profit from it. In a time of world crisis in which people are having such a difficult time, and in which we are essentially captive audiences. And one of the things that this exemplifies is how privacy is a matter of power. Data is important because it gives power, and this is what I argue in my book, Privacy is Power, that whoever has the data will have the power. And if we give too much data to corporations, we'll end up with some kind of plutocracy in which the wealthy set the rules of the game, as we can see is happening with Apple and Google and how much power they have. If we give too much of our data to government, we will end up suffering some kind of authoritarianism or similar, or authoritarian tendencies. And the only way in which people and the citizenry can be powerful enough is if we get to keep our data and we get to control our data. So whenever people think that privacy is not important because I'm not that shy, I have nothing to hide, I'm not a criminal, that's just the wrong focus. That's the focus that many powerful institutions would want you to have, because it's very comfortable for them when they profit from data to make you think that privacy is not important and it's just a matter of personal preference, when in fact privacy is a political matter. So there are reasons to be concerned. We are having more of our data collected than ever. Because of the pandemic, we have restrictions that don't allow us to do away with tech in ways that are very, very tangible. Tech companies have an interest in getting more and more involved with government. So for instance, ex-CEO of Google, Eric Schmidt, has argued for an unprecedented partnership between government and industry. And we can see how many tech corporations are getting involved with the government on account of the pandemic. For instance, Palantir, the controversial CIA-backed company, they collaborated with the NSA in their surveillance program, and now they're collaborating, for instance, in the United States with the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and in the United Kingdom with the NHS. So we should be vigilant of this, and we should be worried about that. At the same time, I feel there are reasons for optimism in that even at the worst of times, when we were most vulnerable and when we were most in the dependent on technology, we managed to see avenues of resistance. And that gives me a lot of hope, and that shows how worried people are about privacy, and that maybe we have learned some lessons from the past. I think many people now see that we should have been more careful after 9/11 with privacy, and not only just assume that our security would be improved if we gave up our privacy. Similarly, now we shouldn't just assume that public health will improve if we give up our privacy. There are many worries about contact tracing apps and whether they're actually useful. So two standard worries is that they might have too many false positives and too many false negatives. So for instance, suppose I go to the supermarket, or let's say suppose I go into a building and it's empty, but I still get infected from the virus from a contaminated surface. The app would never be able to register that. One of the faults of apps is that they deal with proxies, and we're trying to know who has the virus and who doesn't have it. And the best that apps can do is just estimate who might have a virus on account of whom they have been in contact with. But sometimes, there can be contaminated surfaces. That's one example in which there would be a false negative. A false positive would be if, suppose I'm very close to somebody who has the virus, but in fact, that's what our phones think, but in fact, there's a wall between us. So in that case, I would get an alert saying, you're at risk, when in fact I wasn't. So again, we need more studies to figure out to what extent we need contact tracing apps and to what extent they're useful. There have been some instances already in which apps have been canceled. The latest one has been Norway. Norway had a contact tracing app, and recently it's been banned because the authorities deemed that there were more risks from possible hacks and other misuses of data than from the virus itself, now that contagion has gone down and there are so few cases. So this is an example of how contact tracing apps may not be the answer we're looking for. There might be sort of hammers in search of nails. We need vaccines, we need treatment for the virus, we need protective equipment, and it's unclear to what extent contact tracing apps will play a role in getting us out of this mess. And that's it for me, but I would love to hear about your questions, and they don't need to be about the pandemic at all. I prefer conversations than giving a talk, so please send us your questions.
Thank you, Carissa, for this insightful talk. I promise this is the last question regarding the pandemic, but it's true. I mean, it's true that the tracing apps is a big debate, and it has a lot to be with how companies and governments deal with our personal data. So you were pretty negative regarding contact tracing apps, and it's true that there are quite a bit of worries regarding the tracing apps and how they might not be as effective as they look. But the truth is that contact tracing with measures such as widespread testing and quarantines have been proven to be one of the most effective ways. Now, it's true that some countries, and Spain is one of them, is tracing manually with teams of investigators. What do you think about that? Because what we've seen, for instance, in the case of Spain, is that when you have investigators trying to understand the contacts that a person has had during the last couple of days, some people actually refuse to give those data, the data, and communicate who they've been in contact with. So, would that be better? I mean, it might protect privacy better, but the problem is that we might not get the answers that we want. So, what is your take on manual tracing, and also I would like to get your view on. You were mentioning that Apple and Google had too much power, and I would like to understand what is your take on the fact for national sovereignty of the European countries. What is your take on the fact that national official apps will be run on these platforms? I mean, we've seen you've basically told us some of the risks, but what are the concrete risks for someone like me? What is the risk of me, having that app running on my phone? Because again, my perspective and many researchers say that contact tracing with testing and quarantines is the most efficient way to fight the pandemic. So, yeah, what do you think about manual versus automated, and the fact that the big tech are going to be running the automated ones?
Thank you, Carlos. Excellent questions. So yes, I'm quite skeptical of contact tracing apps. It's very unclear to me that they have in fact been a crucial element of countries that have done well in containing the virus. For instance, Denmark has done very well, and the app hasn't had an important role to play at all. There was a study in Italy of a town in which they managed to get completely rid of the virus by using massive testing and quarantine, and no app. So it seems to me that if the app is helpful, and that's a big if, we need massive testing. And if we don't have that, then it's kind of useless to have an app, and to chase the app before we have massive testing being done doesn't make any sense. So I think the most important thing is to have massive testing and protective equipment and all these other things that are actually medical requirements and have little to do with data. With respect to manual contact tracing, that has been for centuries a really important element of containing pandemics. I think it still is. And it's better for privacy because these are typically done by public health authorities and have no contact with any kind of corporations or any kind of, traditionally, of course, that this doesn't need to be the case. And also, it does give, in certain cases, more detailed data. So, for instance, it's true that if I'm on a bus and I don't know the people around me, I won't be able, even if I'm cooperating, I won't be able to tell, a contact tracer who was in that bus with me. But at the same time, I can give a lot more details than an app in the sense of, if I was, in the same building as you for an hour, I can tell them, yes, we were in the same building, but actually we weren't in the same room, or we were on the rooftop, and so it was an open air. So we can give a lot of details and context that an app couldn't give. So I think even if we had an app, we still need the other element in place. And with regards to the power strike between tech companies and governments and citizens, it's a really interesting dynamic. I have to be very vigilant at the time. And I think governments have a duty to stay in power, to be the sovereign leaders that we want them to be. And for that, I think it can help a lot if we tell our representatives, our political representatives, what we want for them to defend, and then we back them. Because if it's like the citizens and the government against the tech corporations, we have much more power to ask tech corporations to behave in ways that are respectful of our rights and that are respectful of democracies.
Thanks. Going back to your report and the research program that you led with us, you set out a set of data principles, and I'm going to read you the first one, which is data collection and analysis is only justifiable if it's necessary to fulfill a value objective for society and individuals. Now, if you were the CEO of a company, you would probably agree that the safety and health of your employees are a key priority and a valuable objective to your workers. So would you then say that health data collection and analysis is justified? I mean, would it be justifiable to require employees and visitors to submit to temperature checks? Would it be okay to require employees to communicate if they have tested positive for COVID? How private that data should be? And basically, here the question is, would the employer be a legitimate actor to carry out this data collection? What is your view on that? Because, you know, organizations have to fight the pandemic too, and they're subject to a lot of pressure.
I don't have an easy answer. That's a very difficult question, so I'm not going to say yes or no. It depends on a lot of factors, and it is questionable whether employers are the right authority to make that kind of decision, or whether it would be better for governments to lead that effort. But in some cases, governments aren't leading the efforts that we need. This is happening in many countries in which either local governments or even local officials and businesses are doing more for the pandemic than, you know, federal or central governments, and this is a problem. So what is very important is to have the consent of employees and the consent of individuals, and it is very important for that data not to be used in any other way. So what we fear and what we see many times is that once data gets collected, it gets used for all sorts of purposes, and people collect data with one kind of excuse, and then it ends up being serving many different interests. And so that is a concern. It's also a concern, the means through which we collect data. So for instance, you know, when my university or my employer or even my doctor collects data, say through a conversation that we're having, and they collect it through another company, through a platform that they don't control, they can't guarantee privacy. And this is something I think we have to change, because we want our doctor to be able to guarantee our privacy, and we want our employer to be responsible for guaranteeing our privacy. And if we depend on all these platforms that we don't have control over and that they could violate people's data, we're really made vulnerable.
We just received a question. Oscar Johnson asks, if artificial intelligence is tomorrow's big technology and their algorithms run on data, can a too strong focus on data privacy not set Europe behind, especially comparing to China and also the US?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks, Oscar. It's true that most of AI works on data. AI as we use it today, which is, you know, the most popular way right now is machine learning. But it doesn't necessarily work on personal data. So for instance, I think there have been two great achievements in AI recently. One is AlphaGo and AlphaGo Zero, this algorithm developed by DeepMind that can win the game of Go. And this has been very important because the game of Go is a very hard game to win. It's traditionally thought to be a very intuitive game, and it allows for many possible plays. And the extraordinary thing about the latest algorithm is that it didn't work on data from humans at all. So it just taught itself. So it created its own data, and through trial and error came to be the amazing algorithm it is. Another example is how algorithms are trying to find new drugs, in particular new antibiotics, through analyzing molecules. And again, they deal with incredible amounts of data, but it's not personal data. In the same way, there are ways to deal with data that are about people, but that there is not personal data. So for instance, there are ways to make synthetic databases in which data is similar to original data, but it's not the original data. We can use methods like differential privacy. So I don't think at all that a focus on privacy will set back. And in fact, personal data is notoriously difficult to work with because it expires very quickly. So say suppose I like something on Facebook today, and maybe 3 months from now I don't like it anymore, but I don't go back and click unlike. And so it's data that changes very quickly, and that if we train algorithms in that old data, there's a good chance that they might be faulty.
Thank you. We have another question from Gerd Payman, who asks, data analysis has proven to be very useful in pro of the public good. What is your view on forcing corporations to anonymize data and this data becoming a public good? Would this help some of the most powerful companies losing their dominant position in the market and promoting innovation?
Excellent question. Again, it's not easy to answer because data is very specific, so it depends a lot what kind of data we're talking about, and one company can be very different from another. But in general, yes, I think many kinds of data should be public so that people can innovate, and this includes also government data. So if we had more data on things like, how does our water work and so on, people could be more easier for them to innovate. But at the same time, it's very, very hard to anonymize data. So we would need to have extraordinarily high standards and maybe change them often, because sometimes what is supposed to be anonymous today isn't anonymous tomorrow, because a new technology is developed that is able to re-identify databases that weren't that we couldn't do before. So we have to be very careful with that. And also we have to be very careful having in mind that privacy is a collective matter, not only a personal matter. And it's a collective matter in the sense that my personal data contains personal data about other people. So for instance, if I sell my genetic data, that contains data about my siblings, my kids, my parents, and so on. But also in the sense that once there is a problem and we get to suffer the consequences of a privacy loss, we usually get to suffer them collectively. So when people gave their data to Cambridge Analytica, and Cambridge Analytica built this tool to try to sway elections, every citizen pretty much around the world suffered the consequences, more directly or more indirectly. So even if there are uses of data that are not exactly personal data, but that could be bad for certain minority populations or for certain countries and so on. And so we have to be very mindful of this power component of data. And it should basically it should always be in favor of the citizen and in favor of data subjects.
Yeah, I completely agree on the fact that data and data privacy is a collective matter. Well, now for a bit of promotion, Carissa, you just wrote a book, Privacy is Power, Why and How You Should Take Back Control of Your Data. In that book, you argue that our personal data is giving too much power to big tech corporations and governments, and that we should pull the plug on the surveillance economy. Can you tell us a bit more about the book, and how do you do that? How do you pull the plug back? I personally don't want to start emailing and using some tech apps. So how do you do that for people who are not willing to stop using tech? And as you say, it's not that easy to stop using these apps.
Thanks, Carlos. Yeah, so I'm very excited about this book. It basically sees privacy in the light of power and thinks about what is exactly power and how did these big companies crept up on us, because and I argue that power is like energy, so it can transform from one kind into another. So if you have enough monetary power, you can buy politicians, for instance, or influence politics. And if you have enough political power, then you can buy military power and so on. And there's a new kind of power that is based on privacy and that we didn't realize was coming up. And this kind of power is related to also the ability to predict behavior and influence behavior. And so I argue that citizens should be worried about privacy, not because they're shy or because they have something to hide, but because we need to protect our liberal democracy. And how do we do that? Well, we do that, we need regulation. There's no way around it. We just need it, and we have some of it, and we need more of it. So I have a list of suggestions of how we can make the privacy landscape better. So for instance, I think anybody dealing with personal data should have fiduciary duties. So just like our doctor has a duty to look out for our own interests before their own, institution that has personal data should look out for the interest of data subjects before their own. And fiduciary duties are based on professional relationships in which there is an asymmetry of power and in which there is often a conflict of interest. So I talk about those kinds of regulations. But the individual can do a lot, even if you're not willing to be this martyr that goes completely tech-free. Tech companies and governments are incredibly sensitive to what we think and what we want. And I don't think a lot of people realize that. So for instance, in the main room in which Microsoft Azure, the cloud platform, is monitored, there are two monitors. One is about the system and how the system is doing, and the other monitors just the sentiment, people's sentiment, what people tweet about regarding Azure and so on. So if we voice our worries about privacy, companies do listen, and so do governments. And there are many alternatives. So for instance, instead of using a messaging app that is not encrypted or that is encrypted but is owned by a company that you don't trust, like Facebook, you can use Signal. And it's free, it's as easy to use as the others. So it's not a huge sacrifice to use another app. Or with email, you can use Proton Mail. And again, it works just as well as most providers. It's not a huge sacrifice, and it makes a huge difference.
Thanks. Okay, we'll try to do some of those. We have time for a last question, and LinkedIn user asks, every time we open a website, there is a cookie collection questionnaire where we choose which cookies we accept and which not. Is this effective, or is anyone monitoring this? It's true that we asked that question ourselves. I mean, do we accept all cookies? Should we, should we refuse to accept all of them? And it actually there's a chapter on the research paper, the research report that we published on data privacy in the individual that talks about targeted advertising. So how do you deal with cookies when you open a website?
So this is in fact not working for a variety of reasons. The most important one is that it's too onerous on the individual. So it's not okay. Just like when you go to the store, you don't need to accept or deny whether you want lead in your food, right? It's kind of ruled out. You know that whatever you buy in the supermarket is edible and you're not gonna die from it. And that doesn't happen in our data landscape, and it should. We shouldn't have to agree to data practices that are unfair to us. So I think that for the moment, it makes a big difference, and you should reject all possible cookies. And there are easier ways to do it by downloading extensions that block those kinds of trackers. And some companies do it better than others. Some, they make it really annoying so that you have to put no to like a list of 20 different options, and some just with one click you deal with it. But again, it makes a huge difference. And if a company is particularly annoying, just close that website and find an alternative. And sorry, I was looking at the comments and I got distracted. But so it doesn't work, and we need something better. But for the time being, just expressing your opinion that privacy matters makes a bigger difference than you might imagine. And it might also protect you from privacy risks. So Carlos had asked about privacy risks, and I forgot to answer that part. But one of the findings of our report, of our survey for EA, was that about 92% of people have had some kind of bad experience online related to privacy. And this is just increasing, right? So either you have had yourself a bad experience, or you know somebody who have had a bad experience. And the more we protect our privacy, the less we're vulnerable to those kinds of bad experiences, like having your credit card number stolen, or being exposed online, or having your password being compromised and your accounts being compromised, and so on.
Okay, thank you. We're getting quite a bit of questions, so we're gonna just run with this last one. Carissa, I'm gonna ask you to be quite brief. Ferdinand Leopold Behamberger asks, California recently unveiled new data regulation that will enter into effect next year. By some account, this legislation is more flexible or accommodating of the quickly evolving nature of data and tech, and thus more useful than the GDPR, he argues, which some consider too rigid. Could you perhaps say a few words about the challenge of finding the right balance between regulated tech and data? I mean,
sure.
Rejoins the debate that we're having before regarding, how do we maintain competitiveness of European industries while protecting our data?
Yeah. So this is really interesting development, and we'll see how the law gets interpreted, because a lot depends on how the law gets enforced and interpreted rather than, the letters themselves. So we'll see how it pans out. It's still too early to tell. And it might be the inspiration for a federal US privacy law, which would be great. And I think it's being discussed, and there are a few bills that are being considered. But in general, I think essentially we should ban the trade of data. We shouldn't ban the use of data, but data shouldn't be the kind of thing that should be bought, sold, and that people should be able to profit from. And I think that's one of the most innovative parts of my book, that I argue for how we can use data and profit from data in the sense of innovating and so on, without engaging in the trade of data, which I think is what makes dealing with data more toxic and more dangerous. So I encourage you to buy the book if you want to know more about how we can do that.
Thank you so much, Carissa. It's been great to have you. I think lots of very interesting insights. A very refreshing view, I have to say, because you're not used to hearing all this. You're all very welcome to download Carissa's report, and also all the researchers' papers that we published a few months ago on our website, cgc.ie.edu. And well, thank you again, Carissa. It's been great to have you. Let me remind everyone to please practice physical distancing, use masks, because contact tracing might not work, but masks are for sure the best way to prevent contagion. So thank you so much, Carissa, and we hope to have you with us soon again.
Thank you so much, Carlos. It's been great to be here.
Thanks.